Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, APIs, Understanding the Business Benefits and Risks. I'm Wade Roush. I'm a business and technology journalist, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. Okay, now I'd like to walk you through our topic for the day and then introduce you to our panelists. As the title implies, we're going to talk today about APIs, or application programming interfaces. So whether you know it or not, your business is probably driven in some way, shape, or form by APIs, which simply put are a way for different pieces of software to talk to each other. If your company's website has an embedded Google search box, for example, then whenever a user types a query into the search box, your site is using an API to access Google's services. If you are using a mobile service like Duolingo, that's connected to one of the new large language models like GPT-4, then Duolingo has an app behind the scenes, an API behind the scenes, connecting the Duolingo app and services to OpenAI's servers where GPT-4 lives. In fact, a lot of enterprise applications today boil down to just collections of services that communicate via APIs. And more often than not, those services live outside of your company's own network. So hopefully all of those APIs are well managed and secure, right? But if they're not, that can be an avenue for security breaches, denial of service attacks, and other threats. And in a world where so much of the work we do and so much of the software that's being developed depends on public APIs, no one can afford to ignore APIs any longer and just assume that they're always working safely and securely behind the scenes. To explain why and what businesses can do to take advantage of APIs without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk, we have two experts on the subject here joining us from Cloudflare. Cloudflare is a company that operates a global edge network of 275 data centers around the world in more than 100 countries to provide security and reliability for their customers' websites and applications. And I want to introduce you now to Cloudflare's Senior Product Marketing Manager, Saikrishna Chavali, and Cloudflare's Field CTO, John Engates. So Saikrishna's job as Product Marketing Manager is all about growing the awareness, interest, and revenue for Cloudflare's API security and management solutions. Sai has a decade of experience building and growing application security testing, data loss prevention, cloud security, and bot management products. He's had product management and product marketing stints at Veracode, CA Technologies, and Proofpoint. John joined the company in September of 2021, and he's responsible for leading the Field CTO organization globally. Prior to Cloudflare, John was client CTO at NTT Global Networks and global CTO at Rackspace Technology Incorporated. Earlier in his career, John helped launch one of the first internet service providers in his hometown of San Antonio, Texas. So, Sai, John, it's great to have both of you here, and thank you so much for joining us. What thoughts would you like to share first?
Thank you, Wade, and welcome everybody as well. Thank you for giving us a great intro to really set the stage. So what we'll do in today's discussion here is have a back and forth with John and Wade chipping in with his thoughts in phases around how did we get to where we are, where APIs are everywhere. And whether you know it or not, your applications and the ones you use at home and at work are all driven by APIs. Then we'll talk about what the state of APIs today really is. What does it look like? We'll think about the benefits that many of you, especially technology leaders and business leaders, may already be aware of. But what are the risks that could be obstacles to achieve and really get all of those great benefits? And we'll finish off with some best practices that we have found from working with APIs and across industries as Cloudflare best practices that you might want to use, irrespective of any technology that you use, processes that you might want to think about. Okay, so let's get into that. Wade did a great job explaining what an application programming interface is. The very quick thing that I would add that APIs really do is, now when you think of a weather app, weather apps are, the data is created by meteorologists. That's who is gaining the data firsthand. But now, when you think of every other place that weather data lives or is shown to you as a consumer, it doesn't mean all of those apps have a meteorologist on their site as well. All they do is they call somebody like AccuWeather or any of the other weather apps that you're most familiar with. And they do that through an API. They ask for weather data for a specific geography. Maybe you put in your location. I'm based in New York, so zip code here, and then AccuWeather or whatever the weather app sends back data again through an API. And we'll talk about the different types of APIs and such. And that's what is shown to you on your screen. And that could be on a mobile phone, that could be on a desktop computer, it can be on a variety of devices that you might be seeing this. So APIs are underneath, kind of transferring key data that we need to make our lives easier and smoother. Now, when we think about the history of APIs, let's think about where it came from and why they have become so popular. And here I would love to get John involved to kind of give us a real Professor John view of things.
Sure. Hey, thanks, Sai, for that. When I think about APIs, I go way back into my history of computing, and I think about, operating system APIs, hardware APIs, ways that developers would engage or interact with other elements of systems. Basically, it could even be, talking across systems with remote procedure calls. But when we think about modern APIs, we think about them in the context of the internet and the web and mobile, right? So think about back in 2007 when Steve Jobs launched the iPhone. It changed the world, right? I mean, we got the Apple App Store, we got the Google Play Store. We started to open up this whole ecosystem of apps and mobile developers. And APIs were fundamental to this. They still are to this transformation that sort of took off. Developers had to use the APIs to interact with the App Store itself and upload their apps. They were using the APIs to interact with the backend systems for payment gateway, giving the ways to move money and resources around to make it seamless. They wanted to make sure the apps worked really well in a way that didn't, sort of get bogged down by bandwidth. And so they had to sort of buffer and cache data and make that experience seamless. And again, on the back end, they were fetching data and posting data via APIs. And they even invented some new flavors of APIs to make this possible. Platform independence was difficult in the early eras of APIs, but REST APIs came to the rescue. And now today, a lot of the ecosystem around mobile really continues to rely on it. Things like push notifications and location data, pulling down data about where you are and what your current location is. And this goes even beyond smartphones. We think about smartphones, but what about IoT devices, Fitbits and thermostats and voice assistants? All of these things are interconnected and interwoven with APIs on the back end, and they're really invisible to the user. But again, they're everywhere. But if you really want to underscore the value of an API, turn your smartphone into airplane mode and see how fun that app is after you can't connect to the API anymore. So again, really, really fundamental to mobile. Sorry, I think I forwarded. I won't touch it, Sai. I promise. I'll leave it alone. I'll let you do it. Social and media and commerce. When we think about these two very, very important trends, they sort of in the same time frame as mobile, but they started a little further back. I remember the era of Web 2. Everybody's talking about Web 3 today, but we talk about Web 2, and that was when the web became more interactive. When people wanted to post images, they wanted to interact with websites, they wanted to make the web much more dynamic. And there were, companies, startups that were built off the back of this idea. Flickr comes to mind when people wanted to post their photos. Even Twitter, the Twitter API, if you recall back in those days, the very first apps on your iPhone were not built by Twitter itself. They were built by third parties, and they were interacting with the APIs on the back end. And today, as we move forward, we really have, a pervasive ecosystem of third-party developers building heavily on these APIs. E-commerce, similar to social, sort of harness the power of APIs. Early adopters, like we think of eBay or PayPal, facilitating interoperability amongst platforms using their technology and really becoming the linchpin for all the payments and shipping services and customer relationship management interactions. And just the whole e-commerce ecosystem is powered and driven off the back of APIs. They transmit so much data. And today we're starting to see a convergence of some of these things, like, social media and mobile and e-commerce. This is sort of leading to social commerce, again, heavily reliant on APIs. Integration amongst these tools gives users the ability to see what their friends are buying and suggest things that you might want to buy. And influencers on social media are really integrating with a number of APIs to make all of this possible and allow you to really buy things as seamlessly and simply as possible across these mobile and e-commerce platforms. Now, throughout my career, pretty much, we've often thought about how to build applications. And for most of that time, it was a monolithic application. In the old days, we built an app and deployed it on our own data center floor. We managed it ourselves on hardware that we owned and operated, and it kind of lived within our walls. But that changed. It really, off the back of some of these other trends, we started to see the uptake of cloud services and the shift to cloud computing. And this was a monumental shift, really, in terms of how and where applications were deployed, how they were built, how application development itself happened. These teams became much more distributed. The applications became compartmentalized into microservices that would serve up a very specific purpose, and then they would be integrated with other elements of the application to create what we think of as a very seamless front-end app, right? And so on the back end, it's complicated. There's lots of moving parts. To facilitate that, we started to see the move to infrastructure as a service, software as a service, platform as a service. Sort of on the trend of cloud computing, a lot of things changed, and that drove what we think of today as digital transformation. The availability of all of these capabilities and the delivery of these capacity services, really helped quicken the pace of digital transformation for companies. And so today, APIs are really the unsung heroes of these transformations. Back in the early days of cloud, these services were exposed via APIs. It's cloud storage, cloud computing, the ability to interact with these services and drive them in an automated way. That's really what led to the DevOps trends that we're seeing, the automation trends around making things like infrastructure as code or security as code. And again, that buzzword of digital transformation today is more reality than buzzword. It's really happening across all organizations, large and small. And APIs are the backbone of that trend. Now, if you fast forward to the 2020s and maybe 2023 to be more precise, we're seeing another trend take shape, right? And it's this move to AI and generative AI. I think we heard at the outset, OpenAI and ChatGPT are sort of the poster child for this trend, but it's happening across the entire ecosystem, the tech ecosystem. So this ChatGPT platform, fastest growing app in history, reached millions of users in just a few days. Millions of users are interacting with these apps every day on the web. But behind the scenes, a lot of companies are interacting with these services via API, right? So if you want to develop against the API that ChatGPT is powered from, you can integrate that into your own apps. And we're starting to see some of that emerge on smartphones and in the form of plugins and other kinds of interactions that people want to do. And we can imagine if we fast forward just a few months or into next year, we're going to start to see these chatbots taking advantage of this very sophisticated generative AI in the context of all kinds of applications, web-based or otherwise. We see it in Photoshop today with some of the capabilities that they're integrating with generative AI in that context. And really, the sky's the limit as to where these apps can go and the richness of the integration that's going to happen over time. So, and as we think about what these capabilities lead to, again, we're communicating with these APIs, and we're going to have to even transform the way we think about our apps. Today, we think about search engine optimization and making the end user experience better. What about in the AI era when we need to make the API experience better? Because the consumer is now a machine, right? The consumer of your web application may be another machine. And so you need to really make the APIs accessible and optimized really for that. So again, indispensable in the era of AI. And if we think about where things are headed, there's a slide here that sort of shows the trajectory of this. This explosion of APIs. It really, it shows a timeline here and a trend line, but this, it's been around for a lot longer than this shows. It's integrated into almost every aspect of what we do today, going all the way back to the origins of the web and beyond, prior to that as well. Some of the things that aren't represented on this slide is sort of the evolution of APIs that's happening as well. So again, I mentioned in the early days, we might have relied on XML or SOAP based APIs, REST APIs, or representational state transfer. REST APIs kind of came into the picture in the middle years. And as we look forward, we're starting to see even more evolution of APIs in a term or a name for an API that you might hear is GraphQL. That's one that emerged out of Facebook, and it allows for even more richness of interaction amongst the apps and the types of transactions, more efficient, especially when you're moving large amounts of data and unstructured data like apps like OpenAI are. And so, again, we can see this trend line going further. I envision, more interactions with things like coding assistants and more applications relying heavily on moving large amounts of data in context here. And that's just the tip of the iceberg that's going to happen over the next few years. So when you think about it in the context of your, actually, let's stop here. Is this silent? I think this is your cue. I'm sorry. I got ahead of myself. I'll let you take over.
No, you got excited. But Wade, I think we have our first poll.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do this. So which of these trends most contributed to your organization using APIs? So choose between mobile economy, social media and e-commerce, shift to the cloud, or adoption of generative AI. And I might just vote myself. Let's see. Okay, here are the results. Okay, it looks like, shift to the cloud, clearly. That's kind of a not a surprising result, really, that almost every business has been affected by a shift to cloud-based computing. How many companies actually have their own data centers anymore? But still, mobile and social are registering there. So what does this slide say to you, gentlemen?
Yeah, this is very interesting. So the shift to cloud, obvious. It's almost everybody who's interested in the topic of anything around digital is thinking about that. But what we're also seeing is, and I'm very excited, as John was saying, a year from now, I would love to run this and see how much more generative AI adoption has gotten, and then see that kind of change, because I think that is, as we are seeing, a platform shift in itself. But one important thing is, for the other two, mobile economy and social media e-commerce, they're not mutually exclusive to each other and not mutually exclusive to the shift to the cloud, as John was talking about. They're interrelated, and that's why APIs are kind of the foundation, because they're behind so many such trends.
Yeah.
So
no, I agree. I think that it's hard to do the others without shifting to the cloud. Today, there's so much that relies on the cloud and the services that we consume every day. Again, turn off your smartphone's radio and just see how much you can access. Right, very little of it is contained on your device. Most of it is in one cloud service or another, and it really is the underpinning foundation of all of the others. So I'm not surprised it's at the top of the list.
And I'll bet you that everybody has tried ChatGPT or some other generative AI, but they aren't using them in their business quite yet necessarily, because that's going to take some more careful thinking about the risks and the benefits.
Still early days for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on. The next area is many of you were probably very well aware of the benefits in this area. John, I know we can give them a quick overview of those. I think
we've already emphasized, again, how pervasive APIs are, but how do they benefit an individual organization? I mean, certainly they are an enabler for integration and interoperability amongst applications. I mean, it's very hard to find an app that stands alone. So the integration, it's kind of like a universal translator. If you expose an API on your app, it means that other people can, consume data out of it or post data into it. And it enables basically a diverse ecosystem to work together seamlessly, right? That's the goal. And it's critical to this interconnected world. It can also improve and increase the efficiency and the productivity of your team. I mean, when we talk about that term DevOps, that's really about increasing the velocity of the development and the operations and making it more stable, more reliable, makes your team able to get things to market quicker in terms of developing, testing, deploying in a more automated way. Really, I don't think that what we see on the web today would be possible without services on the back end that are automated, right? Where do we store our code? We store it in GitHub. How do we publish our code? Well, we pull it out of the APIs and we push it to a service in the cloud, and now it's in front of our users in minutes, right? And the last thing I think is really taking all of that and turning it into new revenue streams, new business models. So many folks out there have data. If they can expose it, they could potentially turn it into value in the form of some sort of a service that other third parties want to consume or want to interact with. Sai mentioned weather data. That's just a great example. If you have that data, other people want that data. It's a great way to monetize it in ways that maybe once were really just impossible. And if we consider how OpenAI or these other services, Slack, for example, we interact with these tools every day, but they're behind the scenes interacting in numbers of ways that we don't see, and really enabling sort of the full breadth of services that we talk about today. I'll stop on this slide for just half a second because it's going to be a transition. If you think about who was Willie Sutton, you probably heard of this guy before. He was once asked why he robbed banks, right? His response was because that's where the money is. And I think a similar analogy can be painted in the context of APIs. The same things that were true about the value that was stored in a bank is now true about how the value that we've talked about is stored inside of APIs and exposed via APIs. That data is extremely valuable, and it makes APIs a target for attack, right? At Cloudflare, the company we work for, we see traffic across the internet. We see probably 20% of all traffic flowing through our network. And of that traffic, when we look at it in aggregate, over 50% is API traffic. And that trend of API traffic is growing faster than any other flavor. So what we're seeing is more and more API traffic growing faster. And that growth has led to a corresponding surge in demand for services to protect that API, right? So people need to deploy measures to protect the money, the data, safeguard the valuable things that are held within these APIs. And I think that that rise of APIs just really underlines the measures that we're going to have to do to protect these banks, so to speak, of the 21st century.
I love the analogy there, John, I think just for the audience, as we were prepping, John brought this up, and it really put this to light. It's kind of so clear with analogies. So let's just kind of get a sense of where we are in terms of that security, right? One thing we saw a recent survey done by the Enterprise Strategy Group, ESG Group, by Tech Target, with Cloudflare and a number of other organizations, found that 92% of organizations say that they've had an API-specific attack in the last 12 months. That shouldn't be a surprise. Everybody's facing it, and whether you know it or not, your IT and security teams are having to deal with it on a daily basis. And the issue is that it's not just attacks, but it's caused losses. The Imperva and Marsh McLennan recent report showed that 12 billion plus combined losses from various API security related breaches were what organizations were facing. And one of the things we've heard consistently, and this has happened when we were thinking about web apps, it's happened when we were thinking about all kinds of areas that we've had a lot of new development in the past, but now happening on APIs, is organizations are seeing a lot of developers skipping all security processes because developers are under pressure. They're under pressure to deliver more value quicker and cheaper. Security sometimes can fall behind. And the risks that to those three benefits that John had mentioned come not just from security, but also as we think about from a lack of compliance or lack of thinking about compliance, and also from scrimping on the operations side and the performance side. So we'll just walk through in this slide kind of some of the main challenges that we have seen organizations face and have to overcome to get to this. So the first risk, let's start, is that if everybody includes consumers or your customers, etc., wants to access your API, how do you tell the good traffic from bad? It's very difficult with the fact that it's all going to look the same given they follow schemas. How do you handle spikes in traffic? Maybe you had a surge in demand, but is that from bots, or is that from other malicious actors, or is that actually customers? And how do you know that these are, how do you know that these are not just attackers who are trying to take advantage of times? Now, unfortunately, attackers have all the time to kind of identify the juicy and soft targets in organizations, so they can be major stumbling blocks. The second thing is we've seen developers love RESTful APIs because that John brought up at the start, and increasingly with GraphQL, because they have so little structure. But with that, it means that security processes can also fall lax. And then security is often seen as a roadblock when it has to be implemented into your organizations. So it may be last on the to-do list. It may not ever get done. And if it has to get done, it might cause slowdowns and everybody's upset. So John, what have you been seeing both from the security side and then compliance and operations that have been stopping people?
Yeah, if I had to pick out just a few things to talk about here, I mean, it's certainly in the security context that abuse and the fraud that is rampant on the internet today. I mean, there's so many harvested credentials, stolen credentials that are oftentimes used and tested against an API, and that's the easiest way for the bad guys to figure out what works and what doesn't, is to figure out an API endpoint where they can play back some of those credentials and see if they have access. So detecting abuse and fraud, and the automated aspect of this makes that more difficult. In the web era, it was easier to figure out what was a human and what was an automated bot of some sort. Well, everything's automated with APIs. Everything looks like a machine on the other side, so it's a little harder to detect, and you need better tools. So that's an important part of this as well. And not just the abuse in terms of putting data in, but also scraping data, right? Scraping websites was one thing, but if you have access to an API where you can download and pull tons of data very efficiently, then that opens you up to a lot of potential problems. I think in the compliance context, it's pretty straightforward. Everybody today across the world is up against a patchwork of compliance requirements that are handed down from them. They have no choice but to comply, and they have to do that everywhere that they operate. And this is becoming more and more difficult. The data flows, but you are now responsible for managing where and how it flows, where it's stored. And APIs play a big role in that. And that last category, operations, I mean, I think that the number one element would be just uptime, right? Making sure that your API is available for all the people that rely on you, because it can have ripple effects across the ecosystem. If your API is not responding quickly, if it's down, or if it's not doing what it's supposed to do, a lot of people can fall over quickly. And we've seen that with very important authentication services or services that we rely on in social media. When those things are down, the world comes to a halt very quickly, and then you don't want to be the person that's leaving everybody in that situation.
Good points there. And so, just in the interest of time, perhaps I might ask that we skip the next poll question and we actually get to some of the best practices. So I'm just going to skip over here. So we talked about the challenges. Let's not leave you behind without some best practices to deal with all of those challenges. What we've done is there's going to be many different frameworks that are going to be out there across security, performance, operations, compliance out there. What we wanted to help you deal with is what is an easy to understand framework that you can go back to your teams, whether in IT, security, or compliance, to work with them. It starts off with, it's this idea of standardize your processes so that everybody knows what to expect and developers are not caught off guard by new processes coming into place. They know when they have to do something. And that the three big areas that we know of are the access controls, because that's been the number one vulnerability that has been exploited in APIs today. 2, data handling. John talked about how important compliance is, and all compliance requirements, honestly, deal with data handling and data storage. And then security testing to ensure, just like with performance testing, as your developers are building, that they know about any vulnerabilities. The second area is monitor. And once you standardize, you need to monitor, are these processes being followed? And how are customers actually using your APIs, and where are they seeing performance issues and such? And also to be able to monitor for attacks that are coming in so that you can tell the good from the bad. I'm going to pause here, but John, any thoughts on these two before we move on?
Well, look, I think, it's super important to have visibility. The monitoring is just about, exposing what's going on, making sure you surface the good stuff and the bad stuff and can sort through those and can give visibility into the organization, not just the security team, but the broader organization, because who's responsible for the data? The data owner is not the security team. It's somebody in the business, and it goes all the way up to the board. I sit on a board, and I know that boards are paying much closer attention, and they're going to need visibility right down into, sort of some metrics around what's going on, sort of on the ground. And the API is sort of, again, that's where the rubber meets the road in that regard. Yeah.
And to further your point, as organizations get more mature, from visibility, they want to put in controls, because now they know what their API usage looks like. And so they want to probably put in controls around, how much traffic is going to come in. But that has to be intelligent and adaptive, because you have to be able to deal with traffic spikes. E-commerce organizations have to be able to be nimble when they see traffic spikes, to be able to understand that is good traffic and we need to allow it. And the second part is being able to protect against unknown threats as well, because there's a lot of new vulnerabilities popping up. There's a lot of new attack paths that attackers are taking, and you need your tools to be able to have that kind of intelligence. And the last part is all of this is in service of, at the end of the day, enabling your developers and your organizations to build apps and APIs faster, better, cheaper, and more securely without breaking the bank. And think of this as a flywheel, right? This is how you learn and improve your processes.
Thanks, guys. So, I just have a quick question for you before we dive into the audience's questions. So, it would be a shame to villainize developers in all of this, right? But because some of the beauty of the whole microservices based sort of architecture that we're moving toward for everything is that you can develop quickly. You can build things up out of small parts. You can mix and match. Nobody has to know everything. You can download code from Stack Overflow or now from OpenAI. You can build stuff really fast. So who can blame developers for wanting to move really fast and maybe occasionally forgetting all of these standards and compliance things? Like, it seems to me like there's a balance here between quick creative development and the kinds of safety and security and reliability you guys are talking about. So where is that balance?
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. So one thing is for sure that at the end of the day, security has to be in service and performance, any other process that you put in place to enable the organization to serve their stakeholders faster, better, cheaper in your methods. And so I think the balance is really in, once you're seeing the roadblocks in place, you can't let it be there as reactive measures. And so that's why we think about first step instead of, many organizations will think of buying the latest shiny tool. It's to standardize your processes, to know what you need and know what your environment looks like. So I think that's a very critical thing that organizations often will dive in. But first they need to kind of standardize their processes.
Yeah, I agree. I think we need to support those developers and not blame them, for the things that they do. They're trying to do their best. They're doing their job. I look at it a little bit like phishing emails. Like, everybody's trying to do the best work. They're not trying to click on phishing emails and open up the company to a lot of risk. Well, developers aren't trying to do that. So I think we need to support them with the better tooling, better monitoring, seamless, that whole flywheel effect. I want that to be as frictionless as possible so that it doesn't put up roadblocks for the developers. But we do need to support them, and that rests on the shoulders of IT leaders, business leaders, boards of directors. Everybody involved in the business needs to see what's going on and have some visibility into this, and then go figure out how to make those developers as productive as possible.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to relay some questions we have coming in from our audience. And this first question is from David, and it's a very general question that could give you guys an opportunity to maybe to go at the flywheel again and explain it in different terms, perhaps. So the question is, what are the pillars of an API strategy? I mean, what choices do we have to make? And what are the criteria for making our choices?
Yeah, let me take that kind of at first step. And John, I definitely love your input here. So first thing is, there is no single API strategy that anybody can take. It will be dependent on your context, and it will be dependent on what benefits you're looking to get after. And so John had talked about the three big benefits being kind of the idea of enhanced integration and interoperability, which is you want your apps and APIs and services to work better with your partners. Maybe that might be in addition, or it might be you're trying to increase the efficiency and productivity of your own developers, and that microservices world was one of those, trying to enable developers to do their work more easily and better. And it may also be, you might be thinking about new revenue streams and business models. Now, what we find is organizations are not doing all three. They're going to be doing some, and at different times, they're going to unlock different benefits. And so that's going to impact what your pillars are going to be. Now, from a performance and security perspective, we talked about those 4 areas: standardize your processes, monitor what's happening, and have the visibility from both the security and performance side. Build in controls so that you can keep the bad stuff out, and then enable your teams through learning and building better processes. Mm-hmm. But that's a more generic one that you might be able to apply kind of across the board, and there'll be other frameworks, obviously.
And I would just say have a strategy. I mean, to begin with, you need to, what the pillars are matters, less than having a strategy. This is a similar challenge when people started to interact with cloud computing. They didn't have a strategy. It sort of happened to them accidentally in many organizations. And then when they got to the end, they kind of looked backwards and said, why didn't we think about some of these things and architect, for this stuff? Well, same with APIs. If you have some intentionality around this, you can put in place whatever works for you, and you can take pieces of what Sai's talking about and blend them with what's working in your own organization and come up with that strategy for yourself.
Mm-hmm. I'll add an example just quickly, because I think the other part of the question was, what are the criteria for making the choice, etc. So an example of this, and this is just one of many different kind of cases. If you're primarily focused on increased productivity and kind of efficiency of your teams internally, you're focused on the internal APIs, microservices, and kind of improving the contracts between services, maybe because you want to improve reliability of your services to customers. What you might be thinking about then is, how do I ensure that my developers can pick up the APIs, can standardize on those access controls, so that now each developer does not have to go create their own authentication system. They can pick from a library that you already have. And that also has a secondary benefit of security. Now, the security team then has only to think about those various authentication libraries of finite number that they have to build protections around. So that's an example of how you can help standardize, and standardization will come with security as well.
Okay. Great, thank you. So let's move on to the next question. So we have another audience member asking a question about audits, something a lot of companies do regularly and have to, especially in specific industries like healthcare, for example. So many cybersecurity and information security audit frameworks do not have explicit questions or controls or points of focus about APIs or API security. So how robust is an audit that doesn't include APIs?
Yeah, this is a question we get all the time. So I'll take examples of many of the popular frameworks, PCI, HIPAA, etc. At the end of the day, they talk about the sensitive data that they're thinking about, whether that's credit card information, whether that is personal health information, etc. Whether that's leaked through an API, or that is unintentionally exposed through an API or through a web app, it does not matter. So at the end of the day, in those, with especially those compliance regulations for specific industries, you need to be aware of all the ways that your data, the sensitive data that you are working with, is exposed, and how it's stored and how it's encrypted. Encryption is something you think about as it's going behind a web app, but then, and how it's being encrypted in your database. But how is that encryption working through your APIs? That's something that you need to be thinking about. So not all of these regulations will necessarily talk about APIs, but at the end of the day, we know that if you fall short, whether that's through an API or a web app, you will still be pulled up. So it's very critical to think about data leakage and how data is handled through your APIs.
So whether or not an audit standard or framework accounts for APIs, you've got to worry about it yourself. You've got to know what's going on, because you're responsible in the end for breaches.
Yeah, so I will say maybe internal audits may not always have it, and then you don't have to check the box. But in compliance requirements, even if you don't have it, if it's not specifically stated, but the data is leaked, then you're still going to be held responsible for that. Okay,
this links to another question, and I'll put that out there. And then John, it would be great if you could jump in about both of these. So Sai, you mentioned encryption. Can most APIs handle encrypted data flows, and does that protect you from some of the kinds of attacks we're talking about? And if not, then what can you do other than encryption?
Yeah, I would say that encryption is definitely one of the best practices for all APIs today. The web is built with encryption, or the web today is built with encryption so that we can move data across these services, across the open internet seamlessly. APIs definitely need that same level of protection, perhaps higher. When we think about encryption, there's a couple of ways to encrypt data. There's the data in flight and moving data. There's also the data at rest. You certainly have to think about where you're storing the data, how you're storing the data. One of the most common things we hear about are the cloud storage bucket that was accidentally exposed. Well, that's an API, right? That cloud storage bucket that suddenly exposes a bunch of data. There's some bad guy that's going to extort you to prevent him from exposing that data. Well, that's API. And if that data had been encrypted in those buckets, you wouldn't have any real significant risk, because there would be nothing for them to expose. So API, in flight, at rest, and even thinking forward. And when we think about the future, there's this idea of quantum computers that at some stage in the future may be able to decrypt data that seems impenetrable today, right? So you need to start thinking about quantum safe encryption as well, because what they may be doing is harvesting a bunch of data today that may be held for a period of time and then decrypted at some stage in the future. So encryption is super, super, super important in the context of APIs. And I would make sure that you put that high on the list of the best practices.
Okay.
I would add one more
ahead.
thing I'd add there, Wade, is with APIs, unlike with web apps, there is a structure to them, but then there's a lot of metadata that comes with it. And often you're thinking, no, the metadata is just fluff. There may be some additional information, doesn't matter. But actually that's going to be very important to protect as well, because that can be the way that attackers are actually gaining intelligence of how your services are working. And so they use especially the responses that they're getting to then build a attack path. So don't just think about just that sensitive data, but also think about the metadata that's coming through your APIs and what you're exposing.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. So let's see. Here's an interesting question. I'm not sure if I completely understand. You guys probably will understand. So, John, you mentioned that frequently the consumer of an API may be another machine, not a person, but another machine. And I would venture to say that that's actually probably the majority of data is actually never seeing human eyes. It's only being exchanged between machines. When stuff is happening sort of below the level of visibility, what does that mean from the perspective of business risk? Is that just the reality that security professionals need to understand that all this traffic is happening mostly out of view, unless you actually open the hood deliberately to see what's going on in there? Does that make any sense?
It does. And I think that's an element of that flywheel and the monitoring, the standardizing, making sure that we're aware and we can discover potentially what's going on. I mean, we need tools. This is an almost impossible task unless you have some scalable tooling to give you that visibility, because there's just too many endpoints. It's a mesh network, so everybody's talking to everybody, and how are you going to sort through what really matters, and how are you going to drill down into the data in a meaningful way? Well, you need a platform and some tooling for that. And ultimately, there are numerous solutions out there that address single points of that. I think at a macro level, you need to think about your business as a platform, and you may need a platform that helps you solve some of this, because it's going to be very difficult to cobble together all the point solutions that you're ever going to need. And because this world is changing so fast, right? I mean, nobody expected AI to take off this year like it did. Nobody thought that was going to happen. Maybe a handful of folks. And here we are with the whole world. Every day I turn on the news and there's some new story about something going on with AI. And so I think that to keep up and keep pace with that, you're going to need platforms that give you the tooling, and you may even need to use AI to give you some visibility into that to keep up with the pace of innovation. And so you're going to lean on companies that understand that and have some ability to deliver that at scale.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, here, let's just keep moving through these questions. Maybe we can get through a few more. So we have an audience member asking, what are considerations to think about with API and API risks if your organization uses a lot of low code or no code tools?
Oh, that's a great point. So you're probably using a software as a service, low code, no code tools. The very important point there is actually behind the scenes, they're using APIs. So it's all about that. Now, to access those apps itself, many organizations may think it's just about the UI of those low code, no code tools, but actually many of them expose APIs as well. And so you as a IT organization, you want to be thinking about how are those APIs being used, and are your may not be developers, may just be very technically savvy business users. How are they working with those APIs? What kind of sensitive data of yours are they storing in those, and how is that those organizations kind of securing their APIs as well as any of the data that's stored in their databases? So I think this goes beyond your organization. In the world of cybersecurity, we think of this as third-party risk management. But third-party risk management often is all about that sensitive data and making sure that you are thinking about how your vendors essentially are storing your sensitive data and how your organization is working with that.
Okay, so don't pretend that just because you're using a low code or no code tool, you don't have to worry about APIs. It's actually like APIs all the way down.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Tell me if this question makes sense. Is it possible to steal, copy, or reverse engineer or spoof an API?
That's an easy question. John, I'll do one quick sentence on it. You can take it away. 100%. So the thing about an API is on the other end, it's another machine generating that traffic. So it is very difficult as the organization receiving that traffic to know whether that is a machine trying to do for your customer, or is that a machine in front of an attacker behind the machine. Because they both look like machines at the end of the day. It's not like one is a human user and the other one is a machine, like in the web world, the web app world. And so that's why spoofing and API abuse is one of the biggest problems that many of our customers are facing today.
And another reason why encryption is public key encryption is so important, because it authenticates who's on the other end. If you have the right key, you're talking to the right endpoint. And if you had sort of a open, unencrypted, wide open API, yes, maybe the data is not super important in there, but if somebody's consuming that and there's no encryption around it, it would be very difficult to authenticate that it's the right one. A man-in-the-middle attack of some sort could again spoof that and pretend to be something that it's not, but encryption makes that much more difficult.
Okay. In the 3 minutes we have left, maybe you can take a whack at this question. So business analysts have a responsibility to gather requirements and address security and compliance issues in new projects. What do you recommend to assure that those technical compliance and security requirements are included in the early stages of a project?
Yeah, there's a term, shift left, right? So bringing security into the conversation earlier, I think that's a really important strategy, is to make sure that you're not waiting till the last possible moment to include the security folks or people with a security mindset. Bring it forward, bring it into the process, into the planning, into the early stages. Put security folks with a seat at the table in terms of your planning, and you'll be much better off. And we won't have to sort of scramble at the last moment. And then security also doesn't have to be the Department of No. They don't have to say, stop this. We can't let this go because we're we haven't had vetted all the the API, what data is exposed, all that kind of stuff. So just get it earlier into the process, I would say, is the big factor there.
Okay. We always like to ask folks a kind of a final lightning round question. And it usually goes something like this. What's the one thing companies need to know about APIs? And I suspect in this case, it's like, Well, the world is changing. The world has changed. We're not going back to a world before APIs. So it's not like you have a choice to not use them in your company's services and architectures. But what is the one thing that you should keep in mind the next time you're greenlighting a project that's going to be built around microservices and APIs?
I just would ask a lot of questions around, making sure that it's not sort of out of sight, out of mind. It's something that the business leaders are aware of, that they're asking these questions around, what are we exposing? How many APIs, getting a catalog of what's there, sort of just making sure that there's visibility and it's not something sort of under the radar, because it needs to be, higher on the priority list than I think it has been in the past.
Yeah. Sai, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, I go back to standardize. And what I mean by standardize is standardize your access controls, your data handling, and your security testing. The more you standardize, the more your developers know what's expected, the more that they can bring it into their and automate it into their processes. That's super critical. And so standardize as much as you can so that developers, wherever they may be, or even business users, can leverage work that's already done and just pull in those libraries as they're building new APIs.
Okay, super. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. John Engates, Saikrishna, Chavali, and thank you to our audience today. So a final thank you to Cloudflare for sponsoring and presenting today's webinar. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.